When my son Daniel called that evening, the light in my living room had already softened into that familiar golden haze that arrives just before dusk. The hour when the day exhales and the house grows quiet enough for memories to speak. And I remember noticing how tired his voice sounded before I even processed his words. The kind of tired that sinks below the surface and settles in the bones. And when he said, "Mom, we just need a little help. Just for a few weeks," I didn't pause, didn't weigh the sentence, didn't ask what help truly meant or how long a few weeks could stretch when spoken by a man already overwhelmed by his own life. Because I am a grandmother, and saying yes felt as natural as breathing. A reflex shaped by decades of loving without conditions, of showing up even when my own needs stood quietly in the corner waiting to be noticed. And I remember sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, nodding even though he couldn't see me. Already rearranging my days in my mind without realizing that I was also rearranging my future. Telling myself it was temporary, telling myself that love, real love, always requires a little sacrifice, and when he thanked me with relief so thick it almost sounded like gratitude. I felt needed in a way that warmed something deep inside me. A feeling I had missed more than I cared to admit, since retirement had slowly drained my days of urgency, and left me alone with hours that stretched wide and quiet. And that night I went to bed thinking not about what I was giving up, but about the small hands that would soon hold mine again. The familiar weight of purpose returning to my mornings. And the next day when I picked up Lily and Ethan for the first time, Lily wrapped herself around my leg as if she had always belonged there. Her tiny arms clinging with a trust so pure it made my chest ache, while Ethan slipped his hand into mine without hesitation, his fingers warm and confident. And in that moment, my house changed, not all at once but steadily. Like water filling a dry riverbed, laughter echoing where silence once lived. Crumbs on the counter where books had rested undisturbed, socks appearing under the couch as if by magic. And I told myself that the sudden exhaustion I felt at night was not a warning, but a blessing. Proof that I was still useful, still needed. Still relevant in a world that often moves past older women without looking back. And when the first week passed, and then the second, I didn't notice the way Daniel began dropping them off a little earlier each morning. Or how pickup crept later into the evening. Or how Rebecca's smile at the door slowly disappeared until one day she stopped coming out altogether. Waving from the car instead, conversations shrinking into quick updates and assumptions, gratitude fading into expectation so quietly that I didn't recognize it as it happened. Because love has a way of blinding us to imbalance. Especially when we are afraid that setting limits might cost us connection. And so I stayed quiet, adjusting my life in small invisible ways. Postponing my book club meetings, telling myself I could visit my sister another time. Ignoring the ache in my knees that lingered longer each evening. Convincing myself that this phase would pass, that soon my house would return to its former stillness. And I would miss this noise when it was gone, not realizing that I was already being absorbed into a role I had never agreed to play. A role that would soon expect more than I had ever promised, more than my body, my time, and my quietly guarded independence could give. As the days slipped into weeks and the weeks settled into something heavier and less defined, my life began to reshape itself around the children's schedules in ways so gradual, I barely noticed until there was no space left for anything else. Mornings no longer starting with the gentle ritual of tea and silence but with alarm clocks and small voices calling my name. The house waking before I was ready, as I moved through it on aching knees, packing lunches, tying shoes, brushing hair, telling myself that this was what love looked like now. That fatigue was simply the price of closeness, and at first I wore it almost proudly. This tiredness, like proof that I still mattered. That my days were still useful to someone, but usefulness has a way of hardening into obligation when it goes unquestioned. And slowly, the language around my help began to change, without anyone ever saying it out loud. Daniel no longer asking if I was free, but telling me what time they'd arrive. Rebecca texting schedules instead of requests. Conversations stripped of courtesy and reduced to logistics. And I found myself nodding along, agreeing before I even understood what I was agreeing to. Because interrupting the flow felt harder than adapting to it. And somewhere in those early months I realized that my calendar was no longer mine. The book club meetings quietly missed one by one. My sister's voice on the phone tinged with disappointment each time I postponed visiting. My evenings ending not with rest but with cleaning up small messes that appeared faster than I could manage. And yet every time exhaustion whispered that something was wrong, guilt answered louder, reminding me that other grandmothers did more. That other women my age were stronger, that saying no might make me seem ungrateful for the chance to be so involved. And so I pushed through the pain in my knees, the stiffness in my back, the way my patience thinned by late afternoon, telling myself that children grow fast and this phase would end soon, that I would regret it if I complained. And it was in these quiet justifications that I lost track of my own needs entirely, blending them into the background until they felt selfish to acknowledge. And when Daniel started calling less, assuming instead of asking, when Rebecca's messages grew shorter and colder, when thank yous vanished altogether, I told myself it didn't matter. That love didn't require recognition, that family was supposed to work this way. And yet there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when resentment surfaced unexpectedly, like when I caught my reflection in the microwave door late one evening, shoulders slumped, hair pulled back carelessly, eyes tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. And I barely recognized the woman staring back. A woman who had once looked forward to quiet mornings and spontaneous afternoons. Now counting hours until bedtime like a lifeline, and still, even then, I said nothing. Because I had learned over a lifetime that women like me were praised for endurance, not honesty, for sacrifice, not boundaries. And so I endured, swallowing frustration along with my pride, convincing myself that speaking up would only complicate things, that I was being dramatic, that this was simply what families did when times were hard. And yet beneath all those rationalizations was a growing unease, a sense that something important had shifted without my permission, that the help I had offered freely was being quietly repackaged into expectation, and the longer I stayed silent, the more permanent it began to feel. As if my role had been rewritten while I wasn't looking. And I had become the supporting character in my own life, present but unheard, busy but unseen, loved, perhaps, but taken for granted in a way that drained the joy from even the moments that should have felt precious. And still I told myself to be patient, to be understanding, to remember that they were struggling and that my discomfort was less important than their stability. Unaware that in making myself smaller to accommodate everyone else, I was slowly disappearing altogether. It was an ordinary afternoon when everything shifted. The kind of day so unremarkable it should have passed without leaving a mark. Sunlight slanting through the kitchen window as I moved through familiar motions, packing Lily's lunch for the next day while Ethan colored at the table. The quiet hum of routine settling around us. And it was only because I was checking for a missing pencil that I reached into Lily's backpack and felt the folded paper tucked carelessly at the bottom, creased and softened as if it had already lived there for a while. And I remember thinking nothing of it at first, assuming it was another notice from school, another permission slip I hadn't been told about. But as I unfolded it and my eyes moved slowly across the page, the words seemed to rearrange themselves into something heavier. Something that made the room feel suddenly too still. Because there it was, in plain ink, official and unquestioning. A school enrollment form listing my address as Lily's primary residence. Not temporary, not secondary, but primary. And for a long moment I simply stared, the clock on the wall ticking louder than it ever had before. Each second stretching thin and sharp, my hands growing cold as the meaning settled in layers. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a quiet, hollow realization that no one had asked me, no one had even warned me. That a decision with the power to redefine my life had been made without my consent. And I sat down at the kitchen table slowly, as if moving too fast might shatter something fragile inside me, listening to Ethan hum softly to himself, unaware that the ground beneath my feet had just shifted. And as I turned the paper over and saw Ethan's name on a similar form tucked behind it, something inside me tightened. Not anger exactly, but a deep, aching sadness. Because this was no longer about helping for a few weeks. This was about permanence. About a future being quietly locked into place while I was busy folding sandwiches and tying shoes. And in that moment I replayed every conversation from the past months. Every casual assumption, every unasked favor, seeing them now with a clarity that made my chest ache. Realizing that the early drop-offs and late pickups, the disappearing gratitude, the shrinking conversations had all been steps in the same direction, toward a conclusion they had already accepted as inevitable. And what hurt most was not the workload or the exhaustion, but the realization that my willingness had been mistaken for consent, my love interpreted as availability. And I wondered, sitting there at my own table, how long they had planned this, whether it had been discussed between them late at night while I slept, whether my name had been written on that form with a sense of relief rather than hesitation. And when Daniel came that evening to pick up the children, I watched him carefully, noticing the way his eyes avoided mine, the way his voice sounded too casual as he thanked me and hurried the kids into their coats. And for the first time since this arrangement began, I didn't smile automatically. Didn't brush off the discomfort blooming in my chest. Because now I knew that the unspoken truth had a shape and weight, printed neatly on a piece of paper meant for a school office. And as the door closed behind them, and the house fell quiet again, a silence deeper than any I had known before, I sat alone with that form in my hands, understanding with a clarity that felt almost cruel that just a few weeks had never been the real plan. That somewhere along the way I had stopped being a helper and become the solution. And the life I thought I was temporarily adjusting had been quietly rewritten into something I had never agreed to live. That night I barely slept. The house too quiet in a way that felt accusatory rather than peaceful. Every creak and hum amplified by the thoughts circling endlessly in my mind. The folded school forms resting on the kitchen table like evidence I hadn't asked to discover. And by morning, my body felt heavier than usual. Not just with fatigue, but with the weight of a truth I could no longer carry alone. Because once something is seen clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend otherwise. And I knew that if I stayed silent now, I would be agreeing to a life that no longer belonged to me. So when Daniel and Rebecca came over that evening, I didn't raise my voice or rehearse accusations. I simply asked them to sit down at the table where I had spent so many hours caring for their children. The same table where I had packed lunches and wiped spills and quietly rearranged my days around their needs. And I remember how Rebecca's posture stiffened almost immediately. How Daniel avoided my eyes, already sensing that something had shifted. And I placed the school forms between us without ceremony, watching as recognition flickered across their faces, relief perhaps, or annoyance, but not surprise. And that was when something inside me finally steadied, because their lack of surprise told me everything I needed to know. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, steadier than I felt, as I said, "I found these in Lily's backpack," letting the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to settle in the space between us. And Daniel was the first to speak, explaining too quickly, too defensively, that it just made sense. That the school was closer to my house, that I was already watching them anyway. That this way it would be easier for everyone. And as he spoke, I realized with a strange clarity that he genuinely believed what he was saying. That in his mind, this wasn't a betrayal but a practical decision, and that hurt more than anger ever could. Because it meant he hadn't seen me as a person with limits, but as a resource, reliable and endlessly available. And when I finally responded, I didn't argue point by point or list the ways my life had been quietly consumed. I simply said, I will help for 3 more months, my words landing softly but firmly. After that, you will need to arrange childcare. Because I am their grandmother, not their full-time parent. And the room went still in a way that felt almost physical. Rebecca's eyes widening in shock, Daniel's expression tightening with something like hurt, and he asked quietly, "Mom, we thought you loved having them." And in that moment, I felt the familiar pull to reassure, to soften the truth so it wouldn't sting. But instead I held my ground and said, just as softly, "I do. But love and responsibility are not the same thing." And the silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, the kind of silence I had spent my life trying to prevent, filling it with explanations and apologies. But this time I let it exist. Because it wasn't my job to make this easier for them. And as they left that night, the air between us strained and unresolved. I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not relief exactly, but a fragile sense of self returning. The quiet knowledge that for the first time in months I had spoken for myself, even if it meant risking their disappointment. And as I stood alone in my kitchen afterward, the table cleared, the house still, I understood that boundaries are rarely met with gratitude at first. That asserting yourself often feels like cruelty to those who benefited from your silence. And yet beneath the discomfort was a growing lightness, a sense that I had reclaimed something essential. Even if I didn't yet know what the cost would be, the weeks that followed that conversation moved differently, as if time itself had grown cautious around us. Every interaction carrying an undercurrent of tension that no one named but everyone felt. And I noticed it first in the way Daniel's messages became shorter, stripped of warmth. How Rebecca's voice at drop-off lost its easy familiarity and settled into something polite but distant. A coldness I had never felt from my own son before. And there were moments when the old guilt surged back unexpectedly, whispering that I had overreacted, that I had wounded them by choosing myself, that a good mother would have endured a little longer, and on particularly hard days. When my knees ached sharply and my energy wore thin by mid, that guilt twisted itself into doubt, making me wonder if I had mistaken exhaustion for injustice. But even in those moments I felt something else too. A quiet steadiness beneath the uncertainty. A sense that while the surface of our relationships had shifted, something truer had aligned inside me, because for the first time since this arrangement began, I was no longer waiting for permission to exist beyond their needs. And as the 3 months slowly passed, I watched Daniel and Rebecca scramble in ways they hadn't before. Discussing schedules more urgently, researching daycares with a seriousness that told me they had believed, until now, that this would somehow resolve itself. And it wasn't easy for them, I could see that. The stress in Daniel's eyes when he arrived late. The frustration in Rebecca's voice when costs were higher than expected. And a part of me still wanted to step in, to smooth the path, to offer more than I had promised, but I resisted. Understanding now that rescuing them again would only reinforce the belief that my limits were negotiable. And during that time I also noticed small but meaningful changes in myself. How my evenings felt lighter even when they were still busy. How saying no no longer sent my heart racing. How the silence in my house, when it came, no longer felt like emptiness, but like rest. And when the 3 months finally ended and they told me they had found daycare, the relief in their voices was mixed with something else, perhaps a grudging respect. Perhaps the realization that they were capable of more than they had allowed themselves to believe. And while our relationship didn't snap back into easy comfort overnight, it softened, slowly, cautiously, like a muscle learning to move again after strain. And I still saw Lily and Ethan. Just now it was on weekends, sometimes after school, sometimes for sleepovers that felt like gifts rather than obligations. Moments I could savor without counting the hours until relief. And one afternoon, not long after things had settled, Lily wrapped her arms around me and said, "Grandma, I like when you smile more." Her words simple and unfiltered, and they landed with a weight that surprised me. Because children notice everything, including when we are quietly drowning. And in that moment, I understood that choosing myself had not made me a worse grandmother, but a better one. More present, more joyful, more whole. And as I watched the children play, their laughter filling my house again, but this time without heaviness, I felt a quiet pride in having endured not just the strain of caring for them, but the harder strain of disappointing those I loved in order to protect my own life. In the months that followed, as my days slowly settled into a rhythm that felt like my own again, I found myself thinking often about how easily love can blur into obligation when we are not careful. How years of conditioning had taught me that being needed was the same as being valued. That endurance was a virtue, and rest something to be earned only after everyone else was satisfied. And I began to see my past with a gentler clarity, remembering how often I had swallowed my own desires in the name of harmony. How many times I had filled silences that were never mine to fix. How naturally I had stepped aside so others could stand more comfortably. And it struck me that this story with Daniel and the children was not an exception, but a continuation of a lifelong pattern. One I had finally interrupted, not with anger or cruelty, but with honesty. And as I returned to my book club, my voice tentative at first, but growing stronger with each meeting, as I began planning that long-delayed visit to my sister, savoring the anticipation like a small rebellion, I felt a sense of expansion inside me, as if parts of myself that had been dormant were gently waking. And I noticed how differently I showed up for Lily and Ethan now. How I laughed more freely, how my patience stretched instead of fraying, how my love felt lighter without the weight of resentment pressing down on it. And one afternoon, sitting in my favorite chair while the late sun spilled across the room, I understood something that had taken me nearly 7 decades to learn. That love should never require erasing yourself. That helping should not mean surrendering your life. That boundaries are not walls but doors we choose when and how to open. And that saying no, especially for women like me who had been praised for self-sacrifice our entire lives, is not an act of rejection but an act of preservation. And when I look at Daniel now, older, steadier, more aware of the invisible labor that once cushioned his life, I don't feel bitterness, only a quiet hope that he has learned something too. That love is strongest when it is chosen, not assumed. And if there is one truth I carry forward now, one truth I would whisper to every grandmother, every mother, every woman standing at the edge of her own exhaustion, it is this: being kind does not mean being limitless. Being loving does not mean being silent, and sometimes the bravest, most life-giving word we can offer the people we love most is the one we were taught never to say. The word that feels like a risk but is actually a return to ourselves. The word that restores balance, dignity, and joy. The word that says, without apology or anger, that our lives matter too. And that word is no.